I cannot believe me, Mary McLeod Bethune, had a meeting with the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. It was wonderful. She started me off laughing. She said, Mary, I know you're an educator. She said, but I've heard rumors that you're quite a beggar. I want to know, what is this about you begging? And how and why would you build a school? I said, Miss Roosevelt, I went to Daytona Beach, and I looked up an old friend of mine, and I told her I wanted to build a school for young girls. And she was very skeptical about it. But she said, Mary, you go on and you do what you want to do, and you can stay with me as long as you want. The very next morning, I was so energetic, I jumped up and I started looking for a cottage. And after quite a bit of inquiring and walking, I found what I thought was an empty cottage. And I asked this man, I said, do you know how much that cottage rents for? And he said, well, that's my cottage, and I charge $11 a month. And I told him what I wanted to use the cottage for. I said, and I don't have the money until I start the school. He said, don't worry about it. The money can wait. What did he say that for? I got excited, and immediately I started running around knocking on doors and begging for brooms and broken furniture, broken dishes, for sponges, for torn cloth, anything to help with this school. I saw a few men sitting around doing nothing, and I had to beg them, because they didn't want to do it. I had to beg them to help me build tables, chairs, and desks out of old wooden crates I had found at the dump heap. But they did it. I feel like that is one of the most important jobs I have, is to beg for what I need for my girls. So I don't mind at all. I actually jumped on my bicycle and I went running to different churches on my bike, getting donations and going to clubs. And finally the time came to where we could open the school. I had 5 little girls, each paying 50 cents a week to attend the school. And I taught these little girls how to sing. And with my contralto voice, we went to the big hotels and we sang to the guests. We sang at different affairs. The hotel even invited us back for different affairs to sing and earn money for the school. Now, in 2 years' time from when we started out with 5 girls, we ended up with an enrollment of 250 students. I said, we've got to expand. And by expanding, meaning we have to build. And I found a property which was part of the dump heap, and I talked that man that owned it into selling all of that property for only $200. A $5 down payment, and we had 2 years to pay off the balance. And I told him I didn't have the $5 on me, but I would be back. And I ran home and made some ice cream and more sweet potato pies, took them to the railroaders, and got that $5. Booker T. Washington came to visit, and he was so impressed with our expansion and what we were doing. And when he left, he was telling everybody about what we were doing at Daytona Beach. And I sat down and I started writing letters to folks that I thought might have a lot of spare money and some that just had a little spare money, asking them to please help us with some donations. You know, it takes faith. And you have to believe. And I'm a believer. I think I'm about the strongest believer you'll ever meet. And I know if you ask, God will provide. So I put faith and believing hand in hand. And that's why when we finished building our first dormitory, it was appropriate to name it Faith Hall. Talk about a whole lot of folks that didn't believe were believers then. And we still needed money because these students had to eat. And it was expensive feeding them, taking care of personal items and all. So I decided with all this property, put it to use, and we're going to have a huge vegetable garden. Now, they couldn't eat all the vegetables that we planted, so we sold them to the neighborhood. We sold them to people all over Daytona. They were willing to buy. And there was this white lady who came to visit Daytona named Mrs. Curtis. And she would always come to me when she bought her carrots and her peas. So after a few months, she comes to me and she said, Mrs. Bethune, I'm ill and I have to go home. But I just wanted to know just how much did I purchase. I pulled out the ledger, I turned it around, and I showed her exactly how much she purchased and how much she paid. Now, Mrs. Curtis had to have been impressed with the vegetables and the bookkeeping, because a couple of months later, we received a check for the school for $40,000. $40,000. Mrs. Curtis had passed away and left us that money in her will. Again, the only appropriate name would be Curtis Hall. Then one of my children got ill. She was very sick and we had to rush her to the hospital. And when we got her to the hospital, they didn't want to take care of her because it was a whites-only hospital, but the doctor knew she may not make it to the next hospital, so he went on and he operated. I went to see that child the next day, and they walked me through the whole hospital all the way to the back. And then they take me out on the back porch, and that child is laying on a cot on the back porch. I was so angry because there were so many empty beds, and I said, we're building a hospital. And we did. We built this hospital, and we added to our curriculum, and by adding to our curriculum, we had nurses ready to serve in the hospital right there on the property. Now, Mrs. Roosevelt, I want to share a story with you. When I was a child, I went with my mother in town to deliver some laundry, and a little girl invited me to play, and she gave me a doll, and she said I could play with the doll. But I noticed books. She had books, and I picked the book up, and as I opened it, she snatched it from me, and she yelled at me, and she says, "You can't read." She hurt me so bad, and on the way home, I looked up to the sky, and I said, God, we're not going to be free until we can read. God, please, please let me be able to read. And 2 months later, I was going to school. And after I finished school, I would come home and teach my siblings. And I even had my grandma crying because I was reading the Bible. And after that, when I finished school, I had to come back and work on the farm, and I taught some neighbors how to read. And then Mrs. Wilson came back and said I had a scholarship to go to Concord, North Carolina to finish my education. God is good. I was on my way. If you want to hear more about my life, contact Women in History.